There's always a huge gap in how much Americans pay for gas, depending on where they live. Last I checked, look at the average price in California, for example, compared to the average price in Kansas. But no matter which state you look at, they all have one thing in common. Prices have broadly been going up because the price of crude oil has broadly been going up.
Israeli strikes on 4 oil storage depots and a refining facility in Tehran.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard is sending radio transmissions to ships, warning them that, quote, no ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz.
Oil prices have been on a roller coaster and remain quite a bit higher this morning.
Donald Trump acknowledges this is happening, but he calls the jumps short-term increases, a very small price to pay for peace, and only fools would think differently. He might be right. Here's the international benchmark price of crude. Here's the short-term price spike he's referring to, peaking at just under $120 US a barrel. And here's the subsequent drop that Trump's alluding to. But he might also be wrong. That critical waterway through which Middle East oil flows out to world markets is still largely closed. Iran has meanwhile threatened to strike back at oil facilities in neighboring countries. This puts into play as much as a third of the world's oil production. If you can tolerate oil at more than $200 per barrel, says Iran, continue this game.
Well, I mean, it's plausible. If this goes on for another month and you're just not seeing those tankers go through, that's absolutely plausible to hit $200 a barrel.
We have the biggest supply shock in history. Oil prices will have to rise to levels that cause economic damage. So I would guess in the 150, 160 range. $200 cannot be ruled out, however, but I don't think the economy could handle $200 for very long.
$200 a barrel would be somewhere around twice the current price, give or take. Now, what I can't do is predict the course of the war. What I can do is show you why very few experts are even bothering to try.
I mean, listen, nobody knows. And the people who sit across the table from you and wag their finger and say they do know simply don't.
It's hard to overstate just how much oil is in the Middle East and stuck in the Middle East. You take a country like Saudi Arabia. They alone have more than 250 billion barrels of oil in known reserves. Iran, more than 200 billion. In fact, look at all the countries surrounding the Persian Gulf: Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and Bahrain. Together, they make up half of the world's known oil reserves. And getting that oil out to world markets, they all rely on the same narrow passageway, the Strait of Hormuz, where about a fifth of the world's oil production transits through each and every day, somewhere between 15 and 20 million barrels a day on average. But that oil isn't really moving right now.
Iranian media reports that authorities have been ordered to set any ship trying to pass through on fire.
All the oil and gas that has been produced in the region is not being supplied through.
So that's a big reason the price of oil has surged up. Oil tankers, unwilling to risk their cargo, create a backlog of barrels with nowhere to go, which has led some of the world's biggest oil producers to cut production. They're having to shut down oil fields because what good does it do to pump oil when you have no way of selling it?
It's been scaled back extensively. I think we probably lost more supply than I think we've ever lost in any other shock or any event.
And so all of the problems right now are about trying to figure out either how to shut down the oil production or find a place to put it. And they've run out of places to put it.
Add to that how dropping a bomb or firing a missile at an oil depot threatens supply.
The bombings just make it a bigger concern, and they heighten the risk that all of this could escalate yet further.
If we see infrastructure knocked out by, for example, a drone or a ballistic missile, it can take months or even years in some cases to repair that piece of infrastructure.
And you start to understand why the price of crude jumped 25% in just 3 days.
G7 meeting of finance ministers held a meeting to discuss the possibility of a joint release of emergency oil reserves.
Now, on Monday, G7 countries met to discuss whether to release onto world markets hundreds of millions of barrels of oil that they've stockpiled as a way of bringing oil prices back down. Collectively, the 32 members of the International Energy Agency, of which all G7 countries are a part, They're estimated to hold just over 1.2 billion barrels of emergency oil in strategic reserves, plus another 600 million barrels of industry oil that private companies hold, also for emergencies. Releasing up to 400 million of those barrels, a full third of government stockpiles, but at the same time, an amount of oil the world typically burns through in under a week. That was the topic of discussion on Monday among G7 finance ministers. But Monday came and went with no clear sign of action. They punted the decision to the following day, where once again, at the time I record this, there's no clear willingness to unlock the vault, so the price of oil remains unstable. Now, you and I don't buy oil. We buy gas, and the price of gas has already been shooting up since the start of the war on Iran. Here's the national average on a gallon of gas in the U.S. today, compared to as recently as a week ago. That's a big jump. And one petroleum analyst put the odds earlier this week at 80% that the price of gas would reach a national average of $4 a gallon. For us here in Canada, that's about $1.43 Canadian per liter. Now, those odds are always changing, but just to give you a sense of how high we've seen the price ceiling go, consider the last time we saw a serious cratering of confidence.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine.
When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, what followed was the biggest spike in the price of oil the world had seen in almost 15 years. And that summer, in the US, the national average for gas crossed the $5 a gallon threshold. The United States had never seen the national average that high before and has not since. But even that isn't the ceiling, because you remember that state map I showed you at the start and how California tends to have higher prices because of higher taxes, stricter energy rules, different supply chains. Their record average price of gas during that first summer of the war in Ukraine, $6.43 a gallon, which would be $2.30 a liter in Canada. And on a really local level, we can go higher still, because in some parts of LA at that time, some gas stations were charging more than $8 a gallon, which is approaching $3 a liter Canadian. Now, I'm not saying the war in Iran will produce these outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, $2 seems to be a high level watermark, in Canada, and there's a psychological barrier there as well. I'll say in the United States, $5 a gallon, that is also a psychological barrier. That is important because you do expect governments will start reacting once consumers are hitting those levels in the United States.
And there are already clear signs the Trump administration is seeing the spike in gas, the spike in oil, and then trying to rein things in. Oil prices have receded slightly on news that Trump says he wants to wind the war down and, along with allies, begin providing military escorts to tankers carrying oil. But words are easy to issue, easy to take back, hard to decipher. So most of the headlines I'm seeing right now, mixed messages, again and again and again. So you start to understand why world leaders are so preoccupied right now with the prospect of this energy problem turning into an energy crisis.
The reality here is that oil prices are an extremely politically important factor. Households really notice when oil prices go up. They definitely, drive inflation expectations.
Energy greases the wheels of the economy, and it's felt in just about everything that we produce or consume. And so it's obviously going to impact everything.
Because the price of oil affects the price of gas, which affects the cost to fly a plane, drive a truck, deliver a couch, power a machine, make plastic or fertilizer. There are people whose job it is to calculate how every single percentage point of sustained rise in oil prices results in what percentage of global inflation and what slowdown in global economic growth. But trying to predict that first number, where oil prices are headed next?
We have no idea how long this will go, how sharp the escalation could be, and what happens in any of those scenarios.
Right now, it's all just one big question mark, and a very costly one.